Welcome to the Sex Science Podcast, where we turn the latest peer-reviewed research on intimacy and sexuality into fun, accessible conversations. Generated by AI and fact-checked by experts, the Sex Science Podcast was created by LaShaw to empower you through knowledge. So, join us as we explore pleasure, relationships, human connection, and everything in between.
Okay, so, we're always talking about like what we put in our bodies, right?
Yeah.
Like food and drinks and stuff. But what about the things that we put on our bodies?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not talking about clothes. I'm talking about sex toys.
Interesting.
So, today we're going to kind of dive into this a little bit about the materials that some of these things are made of, and kind of what the potential risks might be.
Yeah. This is really interesting because you shared some research with me that was looking at the release of microplastics and nanoplastics, and even some chemicals like phthalates.
Yeah, and this is something that, more and more people are starting to use these types of products.
Absolutely. They're becoming increasingly popular.
Yeah. And so it makes you wonder, like, what is the science behind all of this?
Yeah. Are they safe?
Right, exactly.
And what do we actually know about what's in them and what happens to them when we use them?
Right, so this study you found really dug deep into 4 specific types of toys.
They did, yeah.
To see what happens to them with use.
Uh-huh.
So tell me a little bit about what types of toys they looked at.
Sure. So they looked at an anal toy, a set of anal beads.
Okay.
They looked at a dual vibrator and then also just an external vibrator.
Okay, so like the most common types that you might find.
Exactly, the ones that most people would probably be familiar with.
Yeah, so they really wanted to get to the bottom of what these toys might be releasing during normal use.
Right, like when they're actually being used, what's coming off of them.
Yeah, so let's talk about those tiny plastic particles, microplastics and nanoplastics.
Yeah, those are everywhere these days.
They are everywhere. It's a little scary.
Uh-huh.
So how did the study actually test for these?
To mimic the kind of wear and tear these toys would experience, they use what's called a standardized abrasion test. And essentially, it's a very controlled way of rubbing the surfaces to see what particles come off.
Okay.
So it's like simulating the friction that happens during use.
Right. Okay. So like real world use, but in a more controlled environment.
So what did they find out about, like, which toys were the worst offenders?
Interesting question. So they actually found a pretty clear order.
Okay.
From most to least release. The anal toy was the highest releaser of microplastic, followed by the beads, then the dual vibrator, and then the external vibrator had the least.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so there was definitely a difference between the types of toys.
Wow. And did they actually measure the sizes of these microplastics?
They did, yeah.
Because I'm thinking, like, when they talk about, a D50 of, like, 950 micrometers, is that something that we can see?
Right? Are we talking about something visible, or is this microscopic?
Or is it something that could potentially be absorbed by the body?
I mean, that's kind of the big question here, right?
Exactly. And to answer your question, 950 micrometers is very small.
Okay.
You probably wouldn't be able to see it with the naked eye. Just to give you a comparison, the average human hair is about 50 to 100 micrometers in diameter.
Oh, wow.
So these are tiny particles.
Tiny.
And they found that the D50 values range from about 658 micrometers for the beads to about 888 micrometers for the dual vibrator. The anal toy was at 950 micrometers, and the external vibrator had the largest D50 at about 1673 micrometers.
Okay, so the external vibrator was shedding the biggest pieces.
Yeah, you could say that.
But that doesn't mean it was off the hook.
No, not at all, because even though the average size was larger, they still observed a lot of smaller microplastics being released.
That's still concerning.
Yes. And here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
They took these microplastics and put them in water for a month.
Okay, a month.
Yeah, a whole month.
Why a month?
Well, they wanted to see what would happen over time.
In a water-based environment, kind of mimicking what might happen inside the body.
Right, because our bodies are primarily made of water.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what they found was that even smaller nano-sized particles started to appear. So these microplastics were actually breaking down even further.
Into even tinier pieces.
Yes.
So you got these microplastic, and then they break down into even smaller
nanoplastics.
Nanoplastics.
Right. Okay.
And the sizes of these nanoplastics were really tiny. They range from about 432 nanometers for the beads up to about 1,715 nanometers for the dual vibrator.
So even though some of those microplastics were bigger,
Right.
they still break down into these really, really tiny nanoparticles.
Yeah, they can degrade over time.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
That's a little scary.
It is a little bit concerning.
Yeah. So the study also suggested that like what the toy was made of actually impacted the size and shape of these particles.
Yes, that's a really important point.
So tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So basically, each material has its own inherent properties, right? It's going to behave differently. And those properties seem to dictate how it fractured. And that influenced the size and shape of both the microplastics and the nanoplastics.
So some materials might break down into smaller pieces more easily than others.
Exactly. And some might have a tendency to create more jagged edges or smoother surfaces.
Right, which could potentially impact how they interact with the body.
Exactly. And here's another fascinating aspect. When these materials break down into those tiny particles, they actually create a really large surface area. Think of it like a sugar cube versus granulated sugar. The granulated sugar has a much larger surface area exposed to water.
Right.
And so it dissolves much faster.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
So these tiny abraded particles have this huge surface area, which means that any chemicals inside them could potentially escape more easily.
Right, like they have more places to leach out from.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key area of the study, which is phthalates.
Okay, phthalates. So we've talked about those before. We were discussing the flexibility of plastics.
Yeah, they're those chemicals that make plastic more bendy.
Right. So why were they looking for these specifically in sex toys?
That's a good question. So researchers are interested in phthalates because some of them have been linked to negative health effects, animal studies.
Okay, so potentially concerning.
Yes, particularly when we're talking about something that's used so intimately.
Right. Okay, so what did they actually find when they tested these sex toys for phthalates?
Well, what's interesting is that they found phthalates in all 4 of the toys.
Oh, wow. So every single one of them had some level of phthalates.
Yes, that's right.
Wow, okay. And were there like specific types of phthalates that they found?
Yes, so the external vibrator actually had the most variety.
Okay.
It had 7 different types.
Wow.
But the concentrations were generally lower.
Okay, so less of each type, but more variety.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about the other toys?
So the dual vibrator and the beads only had one type.
Okay.
Called dianoxyl phthalate, or DNOP. The levels were quite high.
Oh, okay, so even though there was only one type, the amount was what was concerning.
Yes, exactly. The levels were actually above a specific limit that's used for children's toys.
Okay, so even though this isn't a children's toy, the levels were higher than what would be allowed for a child's toy.
That's right.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions.
It does, and I think that's a really important point we're going to come back to a little bit later. So, we've talked about the microplastics, the nanoplastics, we've talked about the phthalates. So how did this study identify what these toys were actually made of?
Right. So to figure out the base materials, they used a technique called ATR-FTIR spectroscopy.
ATR-FTIR. Okay, and break that down for me a little bit.
Okay, so imagine it like a fingerprinting technique for materials at a molecular level.
Okay, so it can identify the specific types of plastic.
Exactly.
Okay, so what materials did they find?
All right, so the anal toy was made of polyethylene terephthalate, or PE.
PT, okay.
The anal beads were made of polyvinyl chloride, or PVC. The external vibrator was a silicone blend, specifically polydimethyl siloxane, or PDMS. And the dual vibrator was a rubber mixture polyisoprene. And what's interesting is that the manufacturer of the dual vibrator didn't actually specify the material on the packaging.
Oh, wow. So we don't even really know what's in that one.
Not from the label, no.
Wow.
Yeah, and it wasn't always easy to identify these base materials.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, the presence of phthalates and other additives kind of muddied the waters.
Okay, so it was hard to see the forest for the trees.
Exactly. They had to account for all of that extra stuff to figure out what the core material was.
Okay, so putting all of this together, we've got these toys that are releasing these tiny particles, both micro and nano, and they all contain phthalates.
Yeah.
And these are products that are used, on very intimate and permeable parts of the body.
Very true.
So what are your initial thoughts on the implications of all of this?
Well, this is the first study that's really looked at this in this much detail.
Okay.
And it's fascinating because you've got these materials with these chemicals being used so close to the body.
Right.
And it really points to some potential exposure routes that I think need to be investigated further.
Like how these materials and these chemicals might be interacting with our bodies.
Exactly. And the fact that some of these products were labeled as body safe,
Right.
but also had a novelty use only label,
Right.
I think that raises some questions about, consumer information.
Yeah, what does body safe even mean?
Exactly. And how do consumers make informed choices when there's this kind of mixed messaging?
Yeah, that's confusing for sure.
It is.
The study also talked a little bit about lubricants.
They did.
And how those might play a role in all of this.
Right. So based on previous research,
it seems that lubricants could potentially interact with the toy materials and increase the release of these particles and chemicals.
Oh, so it's not just the toy itself.
Right.
But it's also what we're using with the toy.
Exactly. And it could also help transport those particles and chemicals.
Oh, wow. So it's like creating a pathway?
You could think of it that way.
So, we've been talking about children's toys a little bit and how there are these limits on certain chemicals. But for sex toys, it's a little bit of a different story, isn't it? Like there's not as much regulation or in-depth risk assessment.
That's true.
So it seems like the researchers are really saying like, hey, we need to be paying more attention to this.
Yes, I think they're definitely raising a flag.
Yeah.
Saying that more research is needed to understand the potential risks in real-world use.
Absolutely. So just to kind of recap everything that we've talked about today.
Okay.
This study looked at 4 different types of sex toys.
And found that they all released microplastics and nanoplastics during use.
Mm-hmm.
And they all contain phthalates.
Yes.
And I think this really highlights the need for more research to understand the safety of these products.
And to give consumers more information.
Right, because these are products that we're using on very sensitive parts of our body. So, I think it's really important that we continue to ask questions about the things that we're using.
And to demand more transparency.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question.
Okay.
What are you going to do with this information? Are you going to look into the products that you're using? Are you going to start asking more questions?
Absolutely.
What are you going to do to protect yourself and your health?
That's what it's all about.
So thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the world of sex toys and their potential risks. And I think it's just the beginning of the conversation.
I agree.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Sex Science Podcast brought to you by LaShaw. We hope that you learned something new about the wonderful world of human intimacy and sexuality, and join us next time as we dive into more fascinating research. And remember, science is for you. Music for this podcast was produced by SoundRaw.